Week 13 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few defenses I look to start this week. The first one, the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens defense, I know this season it's been a hit or miss type of thing for this Raven D, but this week here, great matchup versus the Denver Broncos that give up the 6th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So the last few weeks here for Baltimore, they're actually pretty good until that Week 12 debacle at the Jacksonville Jaguars. Week 9 in New Orleans, 13 points allowed in that game, 4 sacks and interception. Week 11 versus Carolina, 3 points allowed, 4 sacks, 2 interceptions, a fumble recovery. And then Week 12 at the Jaguars, 28 points allowed, 4 sacks, and a fumble recovery. So right here, they versus a pretty weak offense over there in the Denver Broncos. Back at home once again is this Raven team, where obviously they've had their most success this season at home. So Russell Wilson, he hasn't done anything this season. He's been struggling, and a lot of teams have been getting their hands on him and taking them down for sacks. So in this one, I think they can hold them to the mid-teens, low 20s in this game, get a few sacks on Wilson and a few turnovers. And I like the Ravens this week probably to make it in the top 5 of the defensive rankings once it comes back. The next defense, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So the Bucs defense this season, they definitely took a step back in fantasy football compared to last year. But this week here, a good matchup versus the New Orleans Saints that gives up the 4th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So the last few weeks, we really haven't seen much from this Buc defense, though. Week 9 versus the Rams, 13 points allowed, 4 sacks. Week 10 versus the Seahawks, 16 points allowed, 3 sacks, a fumble recovery. And Week 12 at the Browns, tough loss in overtime, 23 points allowed, 4 sacks, and an intel. But right now, you know this Buc team, they want to get back on track. Monday Night Football, big ball game versus division opponent. And this is the worst division in football right now, but 5-6 has Tampa Bay in first place. So right here, Andy Dalton, I think, is turnover prone, obviously, at this point of his career. And I think this Tampa Bay defense could get on him a few times with a few sacks. I think they could get the ball turned over. And I could see this being a low-scoring game for both teams, where like it's a 17-13 final or something. Because believe it or not, this Saint defense always plays Tom Brady tough. And this week here, I think we'll see more of the same. But I like the Bucs as a start this week. The next defense, the Seattle Seahawks. So the Seahawks, we know last week they got the doors blown off, obviously. But as a one-week use, they're a great defense to use at the Los Angeles Rams. They give up the most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So the Rams are depleted. Matthew Stafford, we don't know if he's going to play. Offensive line banged up. Obviously, Allen Robinson out for the season. Cooper Kupp, he's out many weeks and might as well be ruled out for the season. And the Seahawks here could take advantage of that. So the last few weeks for their DST, Week 8 versus the Giants, 13 points allowed, 5 sacks, 2 fumble recoveries. Week 9 at the Arizona Cardinals, 15 points allowed, 5 sacks, a fumble recovery. And Week 10 at Tampa Bay, 21 points allowed, 2 windows. And then last week, like I mentioned, in Week 12, 40 points allowed, a sack, and 2 interceptions. I don't see this Ram offense doing much. The Seattle unit, they've had some decent games this season, like I mentioned. And this week here, with a good matchup and a Ram team that's depleted, I think this defense turns the corner and has a good ball game and has a good start this week. The next defense is the Cleveland Browns. So the Browns, they're 1 week only use here with a great matchup at the Houston Texans that give up the 3rd most fantasy points to defenses on the season. So this is the Deshaun Watson's return game versus former team in Houston. And I think this defense is going to be amped up and come out and play well here. Last week, they did hold the Bucs down to 17 points. So the last few weeks here for the Browns defense. Week 10 in Miami, they got destroyed. 39 points allowed and a sack. Week 11 at Buffalo, 31 points allowed, 2 sacks. And then last week versus Tampa, 17 points allowed and 3 sacks. So Week 13 at Houston, Kyle Allen, I think Myles Garrett could get him early and often. Jadeveon Clowney, we got to see more out of him. And he's another guy who's a former Texan. So maybe this game is where this Cleveland defense will get going and this offense will take things to the next level. But this week here is a 1 week only use. I like this Cleveland defense as a start this week. And the 5th and final defense I have as a start is the Pittsburgh Steelers. So this Steelers defense, over the last couple weeks here, they're starting to get healthy with TJ Watt back. And they've had some favorable matchups as well. Week 10 versus New Orleans, 10 points allowed, 2 sacks, 2 windows. Week 11 versus Cincinnati, 37 points allowed, 2 sacks, 2 windows. And Week 12 in Indianapolis, they got past that offensive line pretty easily. 17 points allowed, 3 sacks, an interception, a fumble recovery, and a block kick. So right here, Week 13, another indoor game at Atlanta where their offense is pretty much non-existent. Marcus Mariota, I know he's been mediocre this season for fantasy football, but in terms of passing yards, he's not really doing much. About 150, 180 a game he's been throwing for his Mariota. And I think TJ Watt in this front line could get past that Falcon offensive line, get pressure on Mariota early and often, cause a few turnovers. And this ball game, I could see between both these teams being a struggle scoring the football, mid-teens to low 20s. So I think the Steelers right now, they were a decent pickup off the wire. I think they could have another good performance. We're having 2 double-digit fantasy games in the last 3 here, and this is definitely possible once again. So that's a few defense DST units I look to start here for Week 13 of the fantasy football season.